कंपटीशन नहीं हो रहा है कि उसने एक कन्वेंशनल बॉम्ब छोड़ा फिर आप केमिकल बॉम्ब छोड़ेंगे, फिर उसने केमिकल बॉम्ब मारा आपके ऊपर तो फिर उधर से न्यूक्लियर बॉम्ब आ जाएगा। ये प्रोपोर्शनैलिटी का कोई खेल नहीं है, कंपटीशन नहीं है उस। Hello students and welcome to another lecture, and the topic of this lecture is international war crimes. International war crimes, जब भी कोई वर्ल्ड वॉर होती है, जब आप फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर पढ़ें या सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर पढ़ें तो उसमें आपको पता चलेगा कि बहुत सारे कंट्रीज के सोल्जर्स ने डिफरेंट टेरिटरीज में जाके वॉर क्राइम्स कमिट किए हैं। वॉर क्राइम्स कौन कौन से? जैसे सिविलियंस को मारना और उनके बेसिक ह्यूमन राइट्स को वायलेट करना, जैसे उनको मेडिकल एड ना पहुंचने देना, उन तक मेडिसिन ना पहुंचने देना, खाना पानी ना पहुंचने देना, उनको उनकी टेरिटरी से डिसलॉज कर देना या उनकी टेरिटरी से या उनके घरों से डिसपोजेस कर देना। इस टाइप की जो बेसिक चीजें होती हैं वो सब इंटरनेशनल बेसिक ह्यूमन राइट्स वायलेशन होते हैं, वो सब इंटरनेशनल वॉर क्राइम्स में आते हैं। इसीलिए फर्स्ट वर्ल्ड वॉर और सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर के बाद बहुत सारे ऐसे एक्सपीरियंसेस सामने आए दुनिया के, जहां पर इंटरनेशनल कम्युनिटी वाज शॉक्ड टू सी दैट हाउ द सोल्जर्स of different countries had committed war crimes, international war crimes, and therefore it called for a convention to stop these international war crimes. Now let us understand international war crimes. What is the International Criminal Court? Now it is important, while we discuss about international war crimes, it is important that we should know about International Criminal Court. International Criminal Court was established by the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. It was drafted in 1998. It was adopted in 1998, but it came into force in 2002. And so by virtue of this Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court, a permanent international judicial body came into existence called International Criminal Court, that came into being, and it was established on 1st July 2002 when the statute came into force, and it was headquartered at The Hague, Netherlands. There are 123 countries who are 123 nations which are state parties to the Rome Statute and recognize ICC's authority, because once the country or the nation signs the treaty, signs the statute and ratifies the statute, that means it is submitting its jurisdiction to before the International Criminal Court. But surprisingly, the United States of America, China, Russia, and India are not the members of International Criminal Court. They are not the members of International Criminal Court because they are reluctant or they are not willing to submit their jurisdictions to the ICC. I don't know, there might be some political or geopolitical reasons because of which India is not a party, but I strongly believe why United States of America, China, countries like these are not interested in submitting their jurisdiction to the ICC, because their forces have been committing international war crimes since a very long time across the globe. And this is what we already discussed in one of our previous lecture, where we saw that how the US forces have been committing international war crimes in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Yemen. So that is why these countries like United States of America was not interested. India was not interested because India hardly participated in any of the world wars. India was not an independent nation till the Second World War. And so, as a new nation, it had never experienced a world war as a sovereign nation. Now, if this armed resistance in West Asia, if it turns into a global war, if it turns into an international war, then definitely this is going to be India's maiden experience as a sovereign nation to witness and be a party to the world war. The forum was established as a court of last resort to prosecute offenses that would otherwise go unpunished. So this is the last court in the world, and this is the last court, last resort to prosecute offenses that would otherwise go unpunished. If had this not been there, had this ICC not been established, these crimes would have gone unpunished. So, and has jurisdiction over four main crimes. It has jurisdiction over four main crimes. One is the genocide, then the other is crimes against humanity, then war crimes, and the crime of aggression. So there are four crimes which are covered by ICC. One is the genocide, the other is crimes against humanity, the third is war crimes, and the fourth is crimes of aggression. But we are going to limit our discussion only to war crimes here, because genocide is something which is dealt by Genocide Convention, and crimes against humanity and crimes of aggression are dealt separately. So war crimes are important because how war crimes are committed and how ICC deals with them, it is important because Geneva Convention is comes into picture. War crimes are defined as serious violations of humanitarian laws during a conflict. If basic human rights laws are being violated, if basic or fundamental rights of the civilians are being denied, they are being violated by the armed forces, then definitely it amounts to war crimes, like denial of food, denial of water, dispossession of civilians from their houses and territories, killing these civilians, or raping the women, civilian women, or any woman, and this denial of medical aid, stopping of medicines from reaching the wounded and sick civilians. These are some of the examples that we can say out of this understanding that these amounts to international war crimes. The definition established by the Rome Statute of the ICC is derived from the 1949 convention. Now this is important, that the definition that comes out from the Rome Statute of the ICC, it comes out from the 1949 Geneva Convention. So 1949 Geneva Convention, we have discussed this before in our previous lecture, that Geneva Convention is important. Geneva Convention does not only hail from 1949, but it has a history. It was started in 1896 somewhere, and it was then supported by the Hague Convention of the Geneva Convention of 1906 and the Hague Convention of 1907. Then another Geneva Convention came into being, which was in 1929, and then a final Geneva Convention came into being, which was in 1949. So it is based on the idea that individuals can be held liable for the actions of a state or its military. Obviously, earlier, before the Geneva Convention, only the state or the military in particular, military in general, was held liable. The state, okay, the United States was brought to books, and some of the big officials were punished only for the war crimes that their soldiers had committed. That was a kind of vicarious liability. But now the question was, they will be punished, and along with them, the soldiers who had actually committed these war crimes on ground will also not go unpunished. The taking of hostages, willful killings, this is important. Like these are some of the examples that can be cited of international war crimes: taking of hostages, willful killings, okay, torture or inhuman treatment of POWs, and forcing children to fight are some of the more obvious examples. These are quite obvious examples that these amounts to international war crimes. Now, what is the Geneva Convention of 1949? Let us have a look. The Geneva Convention 1949 and their additional protocols. I've already told you the Geneva Convention has a history, and it was the final one came into being in 1949, and there were some additional protocols which came into being in 1977. So our international treaties that contain the most important rules limiting the barbarity of war. They protect people who do not take part in the fighting. Obviously, they protect. This is a convention. Geneva Convention 1949 is a convention to protect people who do not take part in the war, like civilians, like medics, like aid workers. There are doctors who are there who for providing medical aid to the injured soldiers, wounded soldiers, sick soldiers, and affected civilians. Okay, aid workers, they are social workers who are giving and supplying basic amenities to the people. Okay, and those who can no longer fight, wounded, sick, and shipwrecked troops, prisoners of war. So ऑब्वियसली देखिए, खाली सिविलियंस ही है, ऐसा नहीं है कि खाली सिविलियंस ही वो ग्रुप है जो नहीं लड़ता. या चिल्ड्रन ही वो ग्रुप है जो नहीं लड़ता? नहीं, बाकी लोग भी ऐसे हैं सोल्जर्स में जो नहीं नहीं लड़ सकते, जैसे कि वुंडेड, जख्मी हो चुके हैं, नहीं लड़ते, सिक हैं, बीमार हैं, नहीं लड़ते, शिपरेक्ट ट्रूप्स हैं, यानी कि जो पानी की लड़ाई है, मैरीटाइम वॉरफेयर है, इसके अंदर जो शिपरेक्ट हो जाती है, पूरी शिप जो है वो हो गई, डिस्ट्रॉय हो गई, उसमें जो अफेक्टेड हैं वो नहीं लड़ते, जो पीओडब्ल्यूज हैं वो नहीं लड़ते, तो इनके भी प्रोटेक्शन का इंतजाम होना चाहिए। ओके, अब ये देखिए फर्स्ट, सेकंड, थर्ड एंड फोर्थ जेनेवा कन्वेंशन। फर्स्ट जेनेवा कन्वेंशन प्रोटेक्ट्स वुंडेड एंड सिक सोल्जर्स ऑन लैंड ड्यूरिंग वॉर। ये कौन सी वॉर के बारे में? जो लैंड पर हो रही है, उसमें जो वुंडेड और सिक सोल्जर्स हैं, जो जख्मी और बीमार सोल्जर्स हैं, उनके प्रोटेक्शन के लिए फर्स्ट जेनेवा कन्वेंशन। सेकेंड जेनेवा कन्वेंशन प्रोटेक्ट्स वुंडेड, सिक एंड शिपरेक्ड मिलिट्री पर्सनल एट सी ड्यूरिंग वॉर, यानी कि जो मैरीटाइम वॉरफेयर हो रहा है उसमें जो जख्मी, बीमार या शिपरेक्ड, शिपरेक्ड मतलब जो वहां पे जो जिनकी शिप्स, जिनकी ट्रूप्स को डिस्ट्रॉय कर दिया गया है, जो अफेक्टेड है वहां, वो लोगों के प्रोटेक्शन के लिए है सेकेंड जेनेवा कन्वेंशन। द थर्ड जेनेवा कन्वेंशन अप्लाइज टू prisoners of war. The third Geneva Convention applies to prisoners of war. The fourth Geneva Convention affords protection to civilians, including in occupied territory. जो fourth Geneva Convention है, that affords protection to civilians, including in occupied territories. अब देखिए जो fourth occupied territories का एग्जाम्पल कैसे है, जैसे इजराइल ने पैलेस्टीन को ऑक्यूपाई कर रखा है इलीगली, वहां के सिविलियंस के प्रोटेक्शन के लिए फोर्थ जेनेवा कन्वेंशन है, जो कि इंटरनेशनल लॉ है, बट स्टिल people are sitting and watching and nobody is doing anything. Okay, India is a party to the Geneva Convention. What is a criteria for war crimes? Okay, now let us have a look. What is the criteria? Criteria to decide whether an individual or a military has committed a war crime. International humanitarian law lays down three principles. How to determine? What are the parameters? What are the parameters? How are we going to determine that if some army or some person has committed an international war crime? Let us see. Distinction. It is illegal to target objectives that are expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objectives, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. If somebody, see, this is a parameter. If somebody is targeting a civilian residential building, a hospital, a public place like park, cinema hall, restaurant, hotels, that means it is but obvious, that these places are always 24/7, they are occupied by civilians, and if some country or some military force is bombing such places, then definitely it is targeting, it is expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life. No one is so stupid to understand, who cannot understand that bombing a hospital would not cause a civilian loss. Obviously civilian life affect hogi, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objectives, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Agar aisa kahin ho raha hai, it amounts to international war crime. Then comes proportionality. Proportionality prohibits armies from responding to an attack with excessive violence. Okay, you cannot like, ये कोई कंपटीशन नहीं हो रहा है कि उसने एक कन्वेंशनल बॉम्ब छोड़ा फिर आप केमिकल बॉम्ब छोड़ेंगे, फिर उसने केमिकल बॉम्ब मारा आपके ऊपर तो फिर उधर से न्यूक्लियर बॉम्ब आ जाएगा। ये प्रोपोर्शनैलिटी का कोई खेल नहीं है, कंपटीशन नहीं है। उसने 100 बैलिस्टिक मिसाइल्स मेरे ऊपर दागे, मैं उसके ऊपर 200 बैलिस्टिक मिसाइल दागूंगा, ऐसा कोई रूल नहीं है। प्रोपोर्शनैलिटी की कोई जंग नहीं है यहाँ पे। एक्सेसिव वायलेंस आप नहीं कर सकते, आप प्रोपोर्शन के अंदर अटैक कर सकते हैं। एक फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इफ अ सोल्जर इज किल्ड, फॉर एग्जाम्पल, यू कैन नॉट बॉम्ब इन एंटायर सिटी इन रिटेलिएशन। एक सोल्जर मारा गया और आप उसके रिटेलिएशन में पूरा सिटी बॉम्ब कर दें, दिस इज नॉट अलाउड। Precaution. It requires parties to a conflict to avoid or minimize the harm done to the civilian population. Precaution क्या है? It requires parties to a conflict to avoid or minimize the harm done to the civilian population. Obviously, आप avoid करिए और जो भी minimize है जितना कम से कम हो सकता है, अगर unavoidable है तो कम से कम harm पहुंचे civilians को. Gray area in definition. Raids on cities or villages, bombing residential buildings or schools, and even the killing of groups of civilians do not necessarily amount to war crimes, not if their military necessity is justified. The same act can become a war crime if it results in unnecessary destruction, suffering, and casualties that exceed the military gain from the attack. Further, civilian and military populations have become increasingly hard to distinguish. Okay, but if somebody what's the gray area in the definition? See, raids on a cities or villages, bombing residential buildings or schools, and even the killings of groups of civilians do not necessarily amount to war crimes, not if their military necessity is justified. Okay, if the military necessity is justified, then you can bomb them. This is, I don't know how this was legislated and this was accepted. The same act can become a war crime if it results in unnecessary destruction, suffering, and casualties that exceed the military gain from the attack. Further, civilian and military populations have become increasingly hard to distinguish. What is the difference between war crimes and crimes against humanity? This is the last part. The United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect or Genocide Convention separates war crimes from genocide and crimes against humanity. War crimes are defined as occurring in a domestic conflict or a war between two states, while genocide and crimes against humanity can happen in peacetime or during the unilateral aggression of a military towards a group of unarmed people. So these are two basic difference between वॉर क्राइम्स एंड जीनोसाइड एंड क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट ह्यूमैनिटी. ठीक है, वॉर क्राइम्स क्या है? जो डोमेस्टिक कॉन्फ्लिक्ट में होते हैं वो वॉर क्राइम्स हैं, या वॉर बिटवीन टू स्टेट्स में होते हैं वो वॉर क्राइम्स होते हैं. जो जेनोसाइड और क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट ह्यूमैनिटी है वो पीस टाइम में भी हो सकता है, कभी भी हो सकता है, जैसे कि इजराइल 76 ईयर्स से करता आ रहा है. ठीक है, करता आ रहा है, वो एक जेनोसाइड है. और ड्यूरिंग और क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट ह्यूमैनिटी or during a unilateral aggression of a military towards a group of unarmed people. यूनिलेटरल एग्रेशन है, यूनिलेटरल एग्रेशन है कि सिविलियंस का सॉरी इजराइलीज का एक यूनिलेटरल एग्रेशन है टुवर्ड्स अ ग्रुप ऑफ अनआर्म्ड पीपल. तो पैलेस्टीन के एग्जाम्पल अगर हम लें तो वहां पर आपको इंटरनेशनल वॉर क्राइम्स भी देखने को मिलेंगे, जेनोसाइड भी देखने को मिलेगा, और क्राइम्स ऑफ एग्रेशन भी देखने को मिलेंगे, क्राइम्स अगेंस्ट ह्यूमैनिटी भी देखने को मिलेंगे. सो दिस इज ऑल अबाउट international war crimes, and I request you again to scan this and subscribe to the official YouTube channel of Paathshala classes. Thank you.